Hawk, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, of course you would ask that question. Where should I begin? I think since primarily, or at least one of the reasons why we're here is to talk about my flutes, I can tell you that I've been a flute maker for 30 years.
Okay.
Began building flutes by accident, if you will.
Okay.
My family, after a number of years, one of the secrets to living is learning how to whine when you want something. And for a number of years, I wanted very badly to play one of these kinds of flutes. And after a number of years of whining, my family, my wife and my dad, got tired of that whining, so they purchased my first flute, and I loved it. And about 2 months or so after they gifted it to me, I decided that I would improve the voice of it. And knowing nothing about it, how the flute operated, what I ended up doing was ruining it.
Yeah.
And of course, that began some internal whining. And I kind of came to the conclusion that I knew they wouldn't give me another flute. So I had to repair the one that I had ruined. So literally, Taylor, what took 5 minutes to ruin took 6 months for me to figure out how to make it work again. And from that experience, the knowledge that I gathered from that, I applied to new materials and began building flutes with that.
Absolutely. And no, that's so cool. So
I totally agree. I think that the key in all of that is perseverance, though. I always encourage people, whether it's with flutes or anything in life, really. If there's something that you really desire, something that you'd love to be able to do, then you do it. And when you're not successful at it the first time, try it a million more times.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
There's lots that you'll gather from that.
And I think that a lot of people try things, but then they give up, after they mess up 3 or 4 times, and they never really get to the place where you're at, where you're making all these beautiful instruments. I mean, they're pieces of art too. They're gorgeous. And
Thank you.
And so, but yeah, like you said, 6 months to fix one thing that you broke in 5 minutes. And so
Exactly.
it is. It's a lot of work, and it's obviously you have all these amazing instruments now that you've made. What is your kind of process from, or actually, let me rephrase that. Where did you go from, you fixed this flute that you had broken, to saying, I want to make my own?
A great question. As soon as I realized, and it wasn't very long after I repaired the first flute, but as soon as I realized that I had the knowledge of how they worked, at least the rudimentary knowledge, I thought, I'll make new ones.
Yeah.
And of course, that is easier said than done. Even though you might have some concepts up in your mind about how things work, applying that to new materials was a little bit more difficult than just thinking about how it should work.
Totally. Well, you probably had to make a few that didn't work at all.
A few?
Yeah.
I made some flutes that had, here my flutes generally have 6 finger holes, but I've made some with like 12 and 14 finger holes. I'd put a hole in one place and then think, oh, that sounds nice, and then put another hole and then realize they don't work well together. So I'd either plug it with a piece of wood or a cork or what have you. And, it became real clear to me that rather than continuing to make new bodies, I just have to figure out a way to repair my efforts, my new efforts, and learn from that.
Right.
So,
no, that's so cool. So how many flutes would you estimate that you made throughout your career of flute?
A frequently asked question. I have no idea.
Yep. I totally get that.
I don't keep any track of them.
Yeah.
I don't know. For the majority of my flute life, I've used just hand tools to make them, so I don't mass produce flutes. I can't make them as quick as most flute makers who use electric tools do. And a lot of folks today, they keep really great records of their flutes, where they've gone, the numbers that they've made. And it's never been important to me.
Sure. Well, you're probably more of an artist and more of somebody that it's a passion of yours, and so it's not, maybe like you said, it's not important. It's just something that you love to do. And so when you make a flute, is it walk me through the process of, you find like a nice branch or a log in the woods that you're like, that's the one.
Yeah.
And you go from there, or?
Yeah, well, typically, well, I'll preface this with my workshop now has tons of wood, and I very seldom have the need to go searching in the woods for wood. I seldom buy wood, but I do get gifts of lumber and milled wood from woodworkers and other flute makers. And but earlier in my flute making time, I would do just as you described. I would go out into the woods, and primarily I was looking for northern white cedar, but maple and sumac and other types of woods would be fine. I would look for a piece of wood that was standing, what some people would say, standing dead wood.
Yep.
And primarily because I'm impatient.
Yeah.
If I were to cut greenwood, I would have to wait for it to season,
Right.
and that's on average a year for every inch of diameter.
Right.
So sometimes I'd go out into the woods and I'd look for 10 minutes. I'd find a piece of wood. My process has always been when I do take something, I leave something as well. So I leave a gift of something important to me, money if I have it, which I don't, but candy if I have that, but usually I've consumed it by the time I found a piece of wood, tobacco or something important, so that I can acknowledge, one, the gift of the tree, but also acknowledge the disruption of life that I've caused by taking that tree or that branch. There are many organisms that rely upon that standing dead wood for their lives, and I know I disrupt it. So I leave something to at least acknowledge and extend my gratitude.
I like that.
Yeah, thanks.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
So now I told you I might get a little bit nerdy into the woodworking side of it, because I'm really into it. So I know for guitars especially, the type of wood really affects the sound of the guitar. Is it the same with flutes?
Yes and no. I think the primary, I think the flute maker affects the voice of the flute more than the type of wood. Type of wood, let's just look at hardwoods and softwoods, generally speaking. Some flute makers will tell you that hardwoods give you a bright, crisp sound, and softwood a little bit more mellow. What I found over the years, and I think some other flute makers with a decent amount of experience, what we found is that the flute maker, as I mentioned, affects the voice, but the type of wood affects how the wood, the resonance of the voice.
Sure.
So the vibration that you might feel as a player, some sensitive listeners might hear, and there's not really a whole lot that you can do to change that resonance unless you coat your flute with many layers of a really hard finish, like a polyurethane or something. Then that dampens the resonance, but generally there's not much you can do. I use walnut oil as a finish on my flutes. Early in my time with the flutes, I tried different finishes, but they all said toxic. Some said toxic, period. Others said toxic until dry. Yeah. And I just didn't want to put something like that in my mouth.
Totally. Yeah. I totally get that. So share with us what you got here. What can you talk about each one of these, or are they all a little bit different? I'm very ignorant about flutes in general, so I would love for you to share what you have here.
Yeah. So the flutes that I have in front of us here, they're of course different types of wood. This one is made from red flame box elder. Okay. That's the primary wood, and I kind of forgot what the accent woods are. I made this about 12 or 15 years ago. Okay. This is eastern red cedar, which is actually a juniper, as you well know, being a woodworker. This is a piece of black walnut, American black walnut. I love the story of this particular one, this walnut flute. It was a part of a pew in a church. Oh, wow. The church was in Norwich Walk here in Maine, and it was about 300 years old when it was being deconstructed. Yeah. And the person who I didn't know at the time, he had gathered some of this walnut, and then we became friends, and he gave me a few pieces. And I love the idea of making a flute out of something that people prayed on for.
Yeah. What are the tools that you use to construct these, mostly?
To bore out the center of the flute, I'll describe in case there's someone who's not familiar with this kind of flute. Sure. the flute is divided into 2 chambers.
Okay.
So the first chamber begins at the mouthpiece. It's hollow all the way up to right about where this leather tie is.
Okay.
Right there, there's a solid wall of wood inside. And there's a hole on this side of the wall of wood. And then after that wall, there's the rest of the chamber. And there's a hole on that other side of the wall as well. I use a brace and a bit to bore out the center to make to make
Right.
it hollow. I bore from both ends.
Okay.
And stop. I usually I leave about 1/8 of an inch between the 2
Sure.
hollow sections. I use a draw knife and a block plane to do the shaping.
Yep.
Copious amounts of sanding.
Sanding is the worst.
But you know what?
You have to do it though.
You have to
if
do
you
it.
don't, yeah.
And I've learned to love it. I find it to be.
It can be relaxing if you
I've
make
fallen
it.
asleep doing it.
Yep.
To make all of the finger holes and the sound mechanism holes and the blowhole here, I use rat tail files.
Okay.
Around, they're tapered. I heat them in fire.
Okay.
Nowadays, I use a propane torch.
Yeah.
And to make the pieces at the top, I use a carving knife.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love it. So really all by hand.
All by hand.
That's so cool.
It's my wife. Her name is Lisa. Years ago, when I used to bore, well, I still do, but she would have to hold the piece of wood for me, and
Yeah.
I'd be boring it, and we'd be having a discussion. She'd be telling me that I wasn't boring it straight,
Right.
and I'd be telling her she wasn't holding it straight, and we'd go back and forth. And one day, her dad saw this, and he looked, and it was kind of funny, but I understood being a dad myself. He looked, and his eyes got big, and he just turned around and walked out the door.
Yep.
And about an hour and a half later, he came back with a Black & Decker workmate for me. He said,
Yep.
"You just put the wood in that, flip it over on the side, and it'll be fine."
Yep. Stick a level on it real quick and you're good to go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think he was concerned about his daughter's health more than our arguing,
Yeah, I love it.
Me too.
And that's drilling a hole that long, trying to keep it straight. That's difficult.
Well, I've been doing it for 30 years, so not so much anymore.
Yeah.
But early in my time, it was difficult. And, sometimes I'd start with a piece of wood that might be that big,
Sure.
and then I'd end up with a flute that was that thick,
Right.
just because I wasn't sure.
Right.
And, of course, there were those times where I might bore out the side.
Yeah.
But, again, I'm using literally the same tools, and I know them quite well.
Sure.
They're not precise, so they wobble a little bit, and I know the wobble.
Right.
Yeah, so.
You get used to all your stuff.
Absolutely.
I love
Absolutely.
that. This might be kind of an odd question. Is there one that is your favorite?
Not an odd question at all, and I would say absolutely yes.
Okay.
And that one would be the one that I'm playing at the moment.
Right.
So, I mean, each,
Yep.
I have a bag full. I only brought a few with me today. They're all unique.
Absolutely.
They all have a different kind of voice to them, a different feel, because they're made from different woods, and other things contribute to how they feel when you're playing them. It's like did I mention candy before?
Yes.
I like bridge mix.
Okay.
And bridge mix is loaded with all different kinds of, good chocolate-covered things,
Yeah.
raisins and nuts and stuff. And each piece that I take, I like.
Right.
So it's the same with the flutes.
I totally get that. No,
Yeah.
that's so cool.
I actually, I never had the idea of making flutes for other people. Never thought about selling flutes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make them. And when I began making, I made them for me. But
Yeah.
when other people expressed interest, I just gave them away.
Right.
And I still give a fair amount of them away. And there was a gallery in Blue Hill, and someone was having an art opening, and they asked me to come and play for them.
Sure.
I said, yeah, sure. And I had a few flutes, and whenever I went someplace, I brought flutes with me in case I could either give it away or. Well, the gallery owner, she saw some of my flutes, and she said, "Well, I'd like to carry some of these in the gallery. Are they for sale?" And I said, "Sure."
Yeah.
And I told her what the price was, And, you know, she immediately cocked her head and closed one eye, and she said, well, that creates a dilemma for me. And I'm assuming, I assumed that, you know, my price was too expensive. And I think I was asking like $80 or something. And she looked and she said, I could get, you know, $400 to $600 for these
Right.
easily.
Right.
So would you take this much money? She offered me $300, and I just looked, I smiled, and I said no. I said what I want is the $80. I think it was $80.
Yeah.
And if you're comfortable with that, then I am. But if you're uncomfortable with that, then I'll just keep my flutes, and you can do
Right.
something else.
Right.
I mean, I didn't say it quite that way.
Right. No, I totally get it.
Because then, as I still do today, I had such a conflict with exchanging money, you know, for this work. I've been doing it full time now, both as a maker and a player for 25 years, and that conflict hasn't really lessened.
Yeah.
You know, it's still there. I think it's a little bit easier for me to accept money for either my flutes or for playing, doing concerts and
Sure.
things like that. But, you know, I still would much rather do it with no money exchanged. But, you know, it's, as I mentioned, I've been doing it full time for 25 years. So it's how I support my family
Sure.
and, you know, pay bills and stuff. So that's the medium of exchange
Yeah.
nowadays. I'd be
That's
happy
so
with
cool.
gold.
Yeah. Do you have any sort of, you know, influences that made you want to get into playing the flute or making flutes or?
Yes, and but before I speak to them, you know, 30 years ago when I began making flutes, it was fairly unique. You know, I mean,
absolutely.
of course, this kind of flute, typically called Native American flutes. I hesitate. I make faces when I use that term. For a couple of reasons, but the primary one is that Native American is kind of a misnomer, and as you well know, there are, you know, well over 600 nations of indigenous people on this
course.
continent,
Yeah.
different cultures, and each having a name for themselves.
And many here in Maine too, which is
Oh
really
yeah,
cool.
Wabanaki
Yeah,
communities,
I
absolutely.
love it.
So, and I'm Nipmuc.
Okay.
So, I think categorizing the flute or anything like related to indigenous people with this broad term does a disservice because it doesn't allow people to know the individual nature of the various cultures here.
Sure.
It lumps us all together. It also implies that we're the first Americans. Hope you're catching this face. Because, of course, America's a relatively new concept.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
we've been here much longer than that. So I used to sing on a drum, sing songs for people to dance to and ceremonial songs and things like that. Of course, I listened to a lot of native music and I listened to flute for quite a while. And kind of jumping back a little bit, as a child, I tried to play music. You know, I tried the saxophone and tried keyboards. Didn't have any success with that. I gave up when I was about 10. And just kind of felt like I had no musical ability. Then after, you know, listening to this flute for a while and deciding that I wanted to learn how to play one, I think it was just listening to all of the flute players, and there weren't many, but they were the inspiration.
Yeah.
They were what motivated me to at least make the effort to play.
Are you self-taught, or did you have somebody that, you know, a mentor or something?
No mentor. Self-taught, and I'll make another face when I say that, because I'm really of the opinion that, you know, like we were talking about with our tools before, the old hand tools, that those people who used the tools before that in some kind of way, you know, influence what we do. And I think that with music, it's the same way. Certainly, I listen to a lot of, not a lot, I listened to flute music. Again, there wasn't a whole lot then. And influenced by what I heard, but I'm also inspired, and my music is informed by what I hear outside.
Yep, absolutely.
You know, nature, as some people would call it.
Yep.
And at the time, there weren't books. Social media was basically
Sure.
non-existent. There weren't videos and, you know, places to learn. So I would just spend as much time with the flute. My very first flute was with me everywhere I went,
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah.
In my home, it would go from one room to the next. If I was in my car, it would be in the car with me, and I picked it up sometimes for 10 seconds or 15 seconds, sometimes for hours.
Yeah.
And you know, that's kind of where my skills for playing came from, I
Gotcha.
guess. I went to talk with some ethnomusicology students at Berkeley, and after I was done with the classes, I was, you know, at that point in my life, I had been thinking about learning music formally and going to school for it. And the professor, he said, he looked at me, he said, no, don't do that. He said, because then you'll unlearn music. And I had to really think about that. What does that mean, you know? And I mean, I'm not convinced that I know now. I've had other musicians, you know, formally trained musicians say the same thing, that I wished I had learned to play like you play music before I learned formally.
Yeah, that's so cool. So moving on, do you have anywhere that people can find you? Do you have a website or a place where somebody can look up, you know, your flutes, or where you're going to be playing, or book you to do something?
Absolutely. So I have a website. It's
Okay.
just my name, hawkhenries.com.
Okay.
I think that's how you'd find it.
Great.
And then I also have a page on Facebook.
Okay.
Kind of have two, but the business related one, where I don't put anything on there whatsoever,
Sure.
except a photograph every now and then.
Okay.
Or, but those places, you know, my wife kind of encourages me to, particularly with the Facebook page, to kind of list where I'm playing, and
Sure, yeah.
you know, if I have flutes for sale, which I do, things like that. My website has it's quite a lot of reading, and it's
Okay.
more about the kinds of work that I do.
Sure.
With flutes and music related, but you know, a lot of what I do, even though the flute appears to be a central part of it, really it isn't. It's just a ticket in the door to
Sure.
allow me to do the things that I think are important. So,
Sure.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that's cool. Now, do you have any advice to somebody that may be interested in doing what you do, or a woodworker, or a upcoming musician, or somebody that wants to get into the arts?
You know, from the part of our discussion just a few moments ago, I would say, yes, make a lot of mistakes. You know, find whatever it might be. But let's say we're thinking just about flutes, and my bias is going to leak here. In the flute world today, the vast majority of flute makers are not native people. One, and even greater majority of the flute makers, including some native people, are incorporating kind of a European idea of music in the flute to their flute making. So what I mean by that is they're making flutes with very specific keys and concert pitch, concert tunes, things like that. And one of the things that I've observed over the number of years of folks approaching, particularly when they're new, is that it's really frustrating for them, because that's a different kind of precision.
Oh, absolutely.
Than making flutes the way that historically they were made and traditionally they continue to be made by a few of us. It's a different type of precision, and what I'm seeing and reading and hearing is that when folks aren't successful with that, you know, they oftentimes just throw away or burn their instruments. I like to encourage people, if that's their desire, if they want to make a flute that's in tune with an orchestra or a guitar or something, that's fine, but learn the rudiments first.
Sure.
Learn how the flute operates. Learn what happens if you have a flute that's this long versus this long, and what size bore you need to make a flute that big work or a flute that small work. Learn about the relationships between the bore diameter and the finger holes, and you know, all of the mechanisms that make the flute work. And once you have a foundation of knowledge for building a flute, then you can fine tune that, and you can work with concert pitches and keys and things of that nature, or more traditional kinds of voicings of the flute. But I think the same goes for with anything, even with regards to playing. Oftentimes people are like me, listening to flute music, and then finding themselves, just kind of fed up with the fact that they can't replicate it. That was a problem for me in my early years. I, was listening to various flute players, and then would try to mimic what I heard.
Right.
And I would get frustrated. I learned later part of that reason was because my flute wasn't tuned like theirs. But my wife one day said to me, she said, "Why don't you stop trying to play other people's music and play your own music?" And I looked at her like she was speaking, some foreign alien language. I said, "I don't have any music." And she said, "Of course you do. Just stop listening to flute music." So I did. And I literally stopped listening to flute music probably, I think I started listening to this kind of flute music again last year.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I mentioned I like Baroque music, I like reggae music, and West African music, all kinds of musics, but I stopped listening to this flute music. I'm pretty sure it was just last year I started listening again.
Okay.
So
But your own style probably emerged from that, from you stopping listening.
I think my own style emerged from a couple of key places. One is just this broad thing that we call music, and wherever that might be, other musicians, the sound of wind and birds and whales, things of that nature, and my desire to use music to articulate how I feel. So for me, music is prayer, and this may be a clever way of saying that. Well, I'll just say it this way: when one is engaged in something prayerful, there's nothing wrong. There cannot be something wrong. So if I'm playing, playing a song, and some kind of note happens or some kind of sequence happens that I didn't intend, it becomes part of the mix. It's part of the prayer. And
Absolutely.
I think in general, prayers are, for me, effective when they're not rote.
Yeah, and they don't have to be perfect.
They are perfect in and of themselves, however
Exactly.
imperfect they might appear to be. They're living. I might play a song here and then go down the road and play it again, and down the road, or what's happening here informs the nature of that group of notes. So I might extend it, I might change a little melody part of it, or whatever it's called, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
No, that's awesome, and that's good advice. And I've really enjoyed talking with you. This has been really great.
Thank you.
I did have another question too that
Sure.
I just remembered. Do you teach flute making at all? Do you have any interns or any sort of classes that you do?
I've done numerous classes over the years. I've taught people from as young as 3.5 years old.
Okay.
To
Awesome.
I think the oldest person I think she was maybe 87 or 88.
Okay.
She continues to be a flute maker today.
That's awesome.
And all ages in between. Anyone who's interested in the flute, and I may not have said this. Sometimes I have conflict with the idea of European ideas of music being used with the flute, and the whole. And you should stop me if we're running out of time.
No, we're good.
There's a lot of concern about cultural appropriation.
Right.
That, of course, could be an extensive discussion that we could have for quite a long time.
Yeah.
But my desire, one, is to encourage people to be creative, to explore that creative art part of who they are, is to encourage people to learn about the history, traditional uses of this flute, and to carry that knowledge forward with them into however it is that they use
Absolutely.
it. Whether they use it in concert with orchestras or by itself, or however they use it. So my hope is that even if you don't desire to build a flute exactly the way that I do, with the same kind of thinking, you'll at least have some understanding of it.
Definitely. Well, and just to be able to pass along your incredible skill set and your knowledge to future generations of people that are interested in it.
Exactly.
It's a really cool thing to do, and
Yeah.
I was just curious if you did that, because
Yeah.
that's really cool.
Yeah, no, I
Can people find out more info on your website if they want to, maybe message you about learning more about that?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, website, Facebook.
Great.
Yep.
That's awesome. Well, Hawk, thank you so much for chatting with us for a bit. We'll dip out for a second, hear you play some of your music on the flutes that you've made. So
Sounds great.
this has been really fun.
Taylor,
I
it's been
enjoyed it a lot,
wonderful.
and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for sharing this time with me, and I'm happy. Chuck's behind the scenes, but I'm happy he's here and
Me too.
a part of it. And I absolutely love this theater, the Criterion. And for folks who don't know about it, they really should look you up online and see the incredible things that go on here.
It's a beautiful place,
It
and
really is.
we're looking forward to the future when we can get back to some semblance of
That'll
normal.
happen soon, I'm sure.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Well, Hawk, thank you. We'll hear you play in just a minute.
Sounds great, Taylor. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks.
You're welcome.